The room held its breath as one of the most anticipated confrontations in recent political memory was about to unfold. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room, two of America's most powerful black women sat across from each other, the weight of history pressing down on every word about to be spoken. Angela Alsobrooks leaned forward, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Jasmine, I have to ask you directly, what specific Senate experience do you bring to this conversation? Because frankly, the American people deserve to know if you're truly prepared for the magnitude of what Senate leadership actually requires. Question hung in the air like a lightning bolt waiting to strike. Every camera in the room zoomed in on Jasmine Crockett's face. The seasoned congresswoman didn't flinch, but something flickered behind her eyes. Not fear, but the quiet confidence of someone who had been preparing for this exact moment her entire career. Political insiders watching knew this wasn't just any ordinary exchange. This was the question that critics had been whispering in back rooms for months. The question that had been used to undermine rising stars before. The question that had historically been weaponized to keep outsiders from claiming their rightful place at the table of power. But as Crockett straightened her shoulders and took that crucial pause before responding, something in her demeanor suggested that this time would be different. This time, the question wasn't going to land the way Alsobrooks expected. The cameras captured every micro-expression. Social media algorithms were already detecting the spike in engagement. Political Twitter was about to explode. What happened next didn't just silence critics. It rewrote the entire playbook on what political readiness actually means in modern America. To understand why this moment mattered so profoundly, you have to understand what was really happening in that room. This wasn't just a question about Senate experience. This was the latest chapter in America's oldest political battle. Establishment versus change. Traditional pathways versus revolutionary thinking. Gatekeeping versus genuine representation. For decades, political elites have used the same playbook to keep rising stars in their place. They demand credentials that conveniently match their own backgrounds. They create invisible barriers disguised as reasonable requirements. They ask pointed questions designed to expose supposed inadequacies while ignoring the very real inadequacies of those who came before through traditional channels. But this exchange was different because of who was asking and who was being asked. Two brilliant black women, each representing different philosophies about how power should be earned and wielded in modern America. Alsobrooks embodied the traditional path. Work your way up through established systems. Prove yourself worthy by their standards. Earn your seat at the table through patience and conventional achievement. Crockett represented something that terrified the establishment, the possibility that excellence could emerge from unexpected places. That fresh perspectives might actually be more valuable than decades of playing by the old rules. That the American people were ready for leaders who looked like them and understood their struggles in ways that traditional politicians never could. This wasn't just about Senate experience. This was about whether America was ready to embrace a new generation of leaders who brought different kinds of expertise to the table. Leaders who understood the law, not from the rarefied air of elite institutions, but from the trenches of fighting for justice. Leaders who knew policy not from theoretical discussions in mahogany-paneled rooms, but from crafting legislation that actually improved people's lives. The historical significance was staggering. Here were two women whose grandmothers might have been denied the right to vote, now debating who was most qualified for the highest levels of American political leadership. The symbolism was powerful, but the substance was even more important, because what happened in that room would determine whether America's political future would be dominated by the same old gatekeepers, demanding the same old credentials, or whether we were finally ready to embrace leaders based on their vision, their values, and their ability to deliver results for the people they serve. The entire progressive movement was watching. Immigrants who had fought for their place in America were watching. Young people who felt locked out of traditional power structures were watching. Communities that had been told they needed to wait their turn, prove themselves worthy, earn their seat at the table, they were all watching. What happens next doesn't just silence critics, it redefines what political readiness really means. Angela Alsobrooks wasn't asking her pointed question from a place of malice or gatekeeping. She was asking from a place of hard-earned wisdom and genuine concern for American governance. When you understand her journey, you understand why her challenge carried such weight, and why it made Crockett's eventual response so much more powerful. This is a woman who had climbed every rung of the political ladder the traditional way, earning her stripes through decades of public service that read like a textbook. Example of how to build unshakable credentials. As Prince George's County executive, she had managed a budget larger than many small nations, overseeing the daily lives of nearly 1 million residents, while navigating the complex machinery of local government that most politicians never even glimpse. But her path to power hadn't been handed to her on a silver platter. Alsobrooks had started as a prosecutor, spending years in courtrooms fighting for justice. learning the intricate dance between law and politics that few politicians truly master. She understood how legislation translates into real-world consequences, because she had seen those consequences up close in domestic violence cases, in drug prosecutions, in the daily grind of making the justice system work for ordinary people. When she moved into county leadership, she didn't just manage, she transformed. Under her watch, Prince George's County became a model for progressive governance, implementing police reform initiatives that other jurisdictions studied and replicated. She navigated budget crises with the kind of steady leadership that only comes from years of experience making possible decisions under crushing pressure. Her question to Crockett wasn't rooted in elitism. It was rooted in the bone-deep understanding that governing is brutally difficult work that destroys unprepared politicians and, more importantly, devastates the communities they're supposed to serve. Alsobrooks had seen what happened when inexperienced leaders took on responsibilities they weren't ready for. She had watched promising careers crash and burn because good intentions weren't enough to navigate the labyrinthine complexity of American political institutions. The Senate, in particular, was a beast unlike any other political arena. It wasn't just about crafting policy, it was about building coalitions across ideological divides, managing relationships with colleagues who might despise your very existence, and understanding the arcane rules and traditions that could make or break crucial legislation. Alsobrooks had spent years studying these dynamics, learning from mentors who had mastered the art of Senate politics through decades of trial and error. Her concern was legitimate and her credentials were impeccable. She wasn't some establishment gatekeeper trying to keep outsiders from claiming power. She was a barrier-breaking leader herself who understood the difference between breaking barriers and being broken by the responsibilities that came with power. But there was something else driving her question, something that made it even more pointed. Alsobrooks represented a generation of political leaders who believed that excellence required patience, that credibility demanded traditional pathways, that revolutionary change could only come from working within established systems to prove your worthiness. She looked at rising stars like Crockett and saw immense talent, but she also saw the potential for that talent to be wasted if it wasn't properly seasoned by the kind of experience that only comes from years of navigating political machinery at the highest levels. The tension in the room was palpable because everyone understood that this wasn't just a question, it was a fundamental challenge to the very notion that fresh perspectives and unconventional backgrounds could compensate for traditional political experience. But what made the moment so electric was that both women commanded such respect that neither could be easily dismissed, setting up a collision between two equally valid but fundamentally different philosophies about political readiness. But if Angela Alsobrooks represented the traditional path to political power, Jasmine Crockett embodied something entirely different, the possibility that excellence could emerge from unexpected journeys, that diverse experience could create exactly the kind of leader America desperately needed. Sitting in that chair, facing Alsobrooks' pointed question, Crockett carried with her a story that read like a masterclass in preparation for exactly this moment. Her path hadn't followed the traditional playbook, but every twist and turn had been building toward this confrontation with conventional wisdom about political readiness. Her journey began in the courtroom, not as a prosecutor working within established systems, but as a defense attorney fighting for clients the system had written off. While other future politicians were networking at fundraising dinners, Crockett was in jail cells at 2 a.m, listening to stories of injustice that most politicians only read about in policy briefs. She wasn't just studying criminal justice reform, she was living it, breathing it, fighting it, one case at a time. This wasn't theoretical knowledge. When other politicians talked about mass incarceration, they cited statistics. When Crockett talked about it, she spoke from the lived experience of watching families destroyed by mandatory minimums, of seeing brilliant young people ground up by a system designed to crush rather than rehabilitate. Her legal background hadn't just taught her about the law, it had shown her exactly how laws translate into human consequences. The transition from law to Congress might have seemed sudden to outside observers, but those who knew Crockett understood it was the natural evolution of someone who had spent years fighting injustice in courtrooms and finally realized she could fight more effectively in legislative chambers. Her first campaign was a masterpiece of grassroots organizing that proved she understood power not as something granted by institutions, but as something built from the ground up through authentic connection with communities. Once in Congress, she didn't just occupy her seat, she dominated it. Her work on the Oversight Committee became legendary among progressive circles, not just for her sharp questioning of hostile witnesses, but for her ability to cut through political theater and expose the real issues at stake. While other members used committee hearings for sound bites, Crockett used them for genuine accountability. Her legislative record read like a progressive wish list brought to life through practical political skill. Criminal justice reform bills that actually passed, voting rights legislation that gained bipartisan support, economic justice initiatives that translated progressive values into concrete policy wins. She hadn't just talked about change, she had delivered it, repeatedly. Despite being one of the newest members of Congress, but what truly set Crockett apart was her understanding of how different forms of power intersected. Her legal background gave her expertise in constitutional law that few politicians possessed. Her grassroots organizing experience taught her how to build coalitions that transcended traditional political boundaries. Her committee work had shown her how to navigate institutional politics without losing her soul in the process. The pressure she faced in this moment was immense. She knew that millions of people who looked like her, who had been told they needed to wait their turn and prove themselves worthy, were watching to see if she could stand up to the kind of challenge that had historically been used to keep outsiders in their place. But as she prepared to respond, something in her eyes suggested that all those years of fighting in courtrooms, all those late nights crafting legislation, all those committee hearings where she had faced down hostile questioning, it had all been preparing her for exactly this moment. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity as Alsobrooks elaborated on her concerns, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too many promising careers derailed by the brutal realities of Senate politics. Let me be specific, Jasmine Alsobrooks continued, leaning forward with the intensity of someone delivering a closing argument. The Senate isn't like the House. You can't just show up with good intentions and passionate speeches. You need to understand how to build coalitions across party lines with people who fundamentally disagree with your worldview. You need to know how to navigate the procedural complexities that can kill even the most popular legislation. You need relationships built over years, not months. The cameras caught every micro-expression as Alsobrooks drove her point home. And frankly, when I look at your congressional record, impressive as it is, I see someone who excels at opposition, at questioning witnesses, at calling out injustice, at rallying progressive support. But Senate leadership requires a different skill set entirely. It requires the ability to compromise without compromising your principles, to find common ground with people you might personally despise, to play a long game that spans decades, not election cycles. The room was electric with tension. Political reporters were furiously taking notes. Progressive activists watching the live stream were holding their breath. This wasn't just a question, it was a comprehensive challenge to everything Crockett represented about new generation leadership. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't fidget. She didn't reach for talking points or deflect with political rhetoric. Instead, she did something that caught everyone off guard. She smiled. Not a defensive smile or a nervous laugh, but the quiet, confident smile of someone who had been waiting her entire career for exactly this question. She took a deliberate pause, her eyes scanning the room before returning to meet Alsobrooks' gaze directly. The silence was deafening. You could practically hear the collective intake of breath from everyone watching as they realized they were about to witness something extraordinary. Political insiders recognized the moment immediately. This was the same composure she had shown during her most devastating committee performances, the same calm before the storm that had preceded some of the most memorable takedowns in recent congressional history. But this time, she wasn't facing down a hostile witness trying to avoid accountability. She was facing down decades of conventional wisdom about political readiness. The pause stretched just long enough to build maximum suspense without appearing unprepared. Crockett's body language remained relaxed, confident, almost casual in a way that suggested she wasn't just ready for this challenge. She had been looking forward to it. When she finally opened her mouth to respond, her voice carried none of the defensiveness that typically accompanies politicians under attack. Instead, there was something else, a quiet authority that filled the room and commanded absolute attention. But what came next wasn't just an answer, it was a message. Angela, I appreciate that question because it gives me the opportunity to address something that I think gets lost in these conversations about political readiness. Crockett's voice was steady, measured, carrying the authority of someone who had spent years commanding courtrooms and committee hearings. But there was something else there, a quiet fire that suggested she was about to dismantle every assumption in that room. You're absolutely right that the Senate requires different skills than the House, but I think we need to have an honest conversation about what those skills actually are, and where they come from. She shifted slightly in her chair, her posture becoming more commanding as she warmed to her theme. The room was dead silent, hanging on every word. When I was a defense attorney, I didn't just argue cases, I built coalitions. Every single day, I had to convince prosecutors who disagreed with my worldview to see my clients as human beings deserving of justice. I had to find common ground with judges who came from completely different backgrounds than mine. I had to negotiate with people who held all the institutional power while I was fighting from the outside. The first murmur of recognition rippled through the audience. Political reporters were starting to lean forward, realizing they were witnessing something special. You talk about procedural complexities, Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength. Let me tell you about procedural complexities. Try navigating the criminal justice system when you're fighting for clients the system has already written off. Try finding the right legal precedent to overturn decades of discriminatory sentencing when the entire structure is designed to maintain the status quo. Try building a case for constitutional protection when the Constitution itself has been used as a weapon against communities like mine. Alsobrooks' expression was beginning to shift, her initial confidence giving way to something approaching respect as she realized she had vastly underestimated the depth of Crockett's preparation. But let's talk about my congressional record. Since you brought it up, Crockett said, her tone becoming more assertive. You see someone who excels at opposition. I see someone who has mastered the art of strategic confrontation to achieve concrete policy victories. She began ticking off accomplishments on her fingers, each one landing like a perfectly aimed blow. The Criminal Justice Reform Act that passed last year. That didn't happen because I gave passionate speeches. It happened because I spent months in closed-door meetings with Republican colleagues, finding language we could all live with without betraying the communities most affected by mass incarceration. The voting rights restoration bill that everyone said was impossible. I didn't just call out voter suppression in committee hearings. I crafted compromise amendments that brought 3 Republican senators on board. The room was electric now. You could see understanding dawning on faces throughout the audience as they realized that Crockett's media presence, the viral committee moments, the sharp questioning of hostile witnesses was just the tip of the iceberg. You want to talk about playing the long game? Crockett's voice was rising now, not in anger, but in passionate conviction. Every bill I've authored has been designed with a 10-year implementation timeline. Every coalition I've built has been constructed to survive changes in party control. Every relationship I've cultivated has been based on mutual respect and shared commitment to results, not just shared ideology. She paused for effect, letting the weight of her words settle over the room like a thunderclap. But here's what I think you're really asking. Angela, you're asking whether someone who didn't come up through traditional political channels can handle the unique pressures of Senate leadership. And my answer is this. The pressures I've already faced make Senate politics look like a polite disagreement. The confidence in her voice was absolute now, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. I've stared down hostile prosecutors trying to railroad my clients. I've faced death threats for taking on police brutality cases. I've been in committee hearings where colleagues have literally screamed at me for asking uncomfortable questions about constitutional violations. And through all of that, I've never lost a case I should have won. Never backed down from a fight that mattered, and never compromised my principles to make my job easier. You could see the moment when it clicked for everyone watching. This wasn't just a politician defending her qualifications. This was a master strategist, revealing the depth of preparation that had been hidden behind her public persona. The Senate needs people who understand how to build bridges. But it also needs people who understand when bridges aren't enough. It needs people who can work within systems, but it also needs people who know how to change systems that aren't working. It needs people with traditional experience, but it also needs people who bring different kinds of expertise to challenges that traditional approaches haven't been able to solve. The room had gone completely silent, except for the soft clicking of cameras capturing what everyone realized was a defining moment in political discourse. So yes, Angela, I'm ready for the Senate. But more importantly, the Senate is ready for leaders like me. The moment Crockett finished speaking, the room erupted. Not in chaos, but in the kind of electric energy that follows a performance so commanding that it fundamentally shifts everyone's understanding of what they just witnessed. Angela Alsobrooks was the first to respond, and her reaction told the entire story. Instead of doubling down on her challenge or offering a defensive rebuttal, she did something that stunned everyone watching. She nodded slowly, a smile of genuine respect spreading across her face. That, she said simply, is exactly the kind of answer the American people deserve to hear. But while the live audience was still processing what they had just witnessed, social media was already exploding. Within minutes, clips of Crockett's response were racing across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram with the velocity of a wildfire. The hashtags started organically. Hashtag Crockett Mic Drop appeared first, followed quickly by hashtag Senate Ready and hashtag New Generation Leadership. But it was hashtag THATS, my representative, that really caught fire. As users across the country shared personal stories about feeling seen and validated by Crockett's redefinition of political readiness, progressive activist organizations that had been watching the live stream immediately pivoted their social media strategies. Within an hour, videos of key moments from Crockett's response were being shared by accounts with millions of followers, each adding their own commentary about why this moment mattered for the future of American politics. The rapid-fire Twitter reactions from political insiders painted a picture of genuine shock at the depth and sophistication of Crockett's response. I've covered politics for 30 years, and I've never seen anyone dismantle conventional wisdom that effectively, tweeted veteran journalist Maria Santos. This wasn't just a good answer, this was a fundamental reframing of what political experience actually means. Congressional colleagues from both parties were quick to weigh in. Progressive stalwarts like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar shared clips with commentary celebrating Crockett's articulation of why diverse experience strengthens rather than weakens political leadership. But perhaps more significantly, moderate Democrats and even some Republicans began sharing the clips as well, focusing on Crockett's emphasis on coalition building and practical results. The commentary from established political analysts revealed just how dramatically the narrative had shifted. CNN's senior political correspondent noted that Crockett didn't just defend her qualifications, she made the case that traditional pathways to political power might actually be inadequate preparation for the challenges facing modern America. MSNBC's evening hosts dedicated entire segments to breaking down the strategic brilliance of her response, with one noting that she turned what could have been a defensive moment into an offensive masterpiece that puts the burden of proof back on traditional politicians to justify why their experience is superior. But it was the reaction from conservative media that really showed how comprehensively Crockett had dominated the exchange. Instead of mocking her response or dismissing her qualifications, conservative commentators found themselves grudgingly acknowledging the strength of her argument. Fox News political analyst Brett Hawkins admitted on air that regardless of your ideology, you have to respect the strategic sophistication of that response. The viral clips weren't just spreading among political junkies. Ordinary Americans were sharing the videos with commentary that revealed why Crockett's message was resonating so powerfully. This is what it looks like when someone who actually understands struggle gets to speak truth to power, wrote one user whose tweet was shared thousands of times. Immigration advocacy groups seized on Crockett's reframing of experience, sharing the clip with commentary about how her message applied to immigrant communities, who are constantly told their international experience and education don't count in American contexts. Labor organizers highlighted her emphasis on fighting for people the system has written off. The ripple effects spread beyond social media into traditional political coverage. By the evening news cycle, major networks were leading with the story, not as a political controversy, but as a defining moment that crystallized the debate between establishment and progressive approaches to political leadership. Political fundraising. Emails from progressive organizations across the country began featuring clips from Crockett's response, with donation pages that crashed from traffic overload as supporters rushed to contribute to candidates who embodied her vision of diverse, experienced leadership. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from the Senate itself, where multiple sitting senators from both parties issued statements acknowledging the strength of Crockett's argument and welcoming the kind of diverse experience she represented to the upper chamber. The narrative had completely flipped. What began as a challenge to Crockett's qualifications had become a celebration of exactly why America needed leaders like her. But the real victory that day wasn't just political, it was philosophical. Jasmine Crockett had done something that transcended the immediate moment and spoke to the deepest questions about how America defines worthiness, merit, and readiness for leadership. For too long, American politics has operated under the assumption that there's only one pathway to credibility, a narrow corridor of elite institutions, traditional career progressions, and establishment validation. This system hasn't just excluded talented people. It has actively told entire communities that their experiences, their struggles, and their forms of expertise don't count in the halls of power. Crockett's response shattered that assumption with surgical precision. She didn't just defend her qualifications. She redefined what qualifications should look like in a democracy that claims to represent all of its people. Her message rang with the kind of truth that resonates across communities because it speaks to universal experiences of being underestimated, overlooked, or told that your background isn't the right kind of background. Think about the immigrant parents who were told their advanced degrees from their home countries didn't count in America, who had to start over in entry-level positions despite decades of expertise. Think about the working-class students who were told they didn't have the right preparation for elite universities, despite having navigated challenges that would destroy most privileged students. Think about the community organizers who were told they weren't serious enough for policy roles, despite having spent years solving problems that established politicians couldn't even identify. Crockett's triumph was their triumph because she had articulated something they had always known but rarely heard acknowledged in spaces of power, that different kinds of struggle create different kinds of strength, and that America is at its best when it recognizes and celebrates that diversity of experience. Her response embodied the most fundamental American ideal, that merit should matter more than pedigree, that what you've accomplished should count more than where you came from, and that the content of your character and the strength of your capabilities should determine your worthiness for leadership. But there was something even deeper happening in that moment. Crockett wasn't just making the case for herself, she was making the case for a vision of America where excellence can emerge from unexpected places, where the experiences that mainstream society devalues might actually be the most valuable. Preparation for the challenges we face. The criminal justice system that she had navigated as a defense attorney hadn't just taught her about law, it had taught her about resilience, strategic thinking under pressure, and the ability to find hope and solutions in seemingly impossible circumstances. The communities she had served hadn't just given her political support, they had given her a masterclass in how to build trust, deliver results, and maintain authenticity in the face of systemic opposition. This was the American dream in its purest form, not as a fairy tale about anyone being able to achieve anything, but as a promise that different paths can lead to the same destination of excellence, and that a truly democratic society should celebrate rather than dismiss. That diversity of journey. The moment crystallized something that millions of Americans had felt but rarely seen, reflected in political discourse. That authentic leadership doesn't require you to abandon your background or apologize for your unconventional path. Instead, it requires you to transform your unique experiences into wisdom that serves everyone. In a country built by immigrants, shaped by outsiders, and strengthened by people who refuse to accept that traditional barriers should define their limitations, Crockett's response felt like a return to founding principles that had been forgotten by too many in positions of power. This wasn't just about politics, this was about the soul of American opportunity itself. And there you have it, the moment when Angela Alsobrooks questioned Jasmine Crockett on Senate experience. And Crockett's answer didn't just silence critics, it rewrote the entire conversation about what political readiness actually means. In modern America, what we witnessed wasn't just a brilliant response to a challenging question. It was a masterclass in how authentic excellence speaks for itself when given the platform to shine. Crockett didn't just defend her qualifications. She expanded our understanding of what qualifications should look like in a democracy that truly represents its people. The critics who doubted her depth, who questioned her readiness, who assumed that unconventional pathways meant inadequate preparation, they weren't just silenced, they were educated. They learned that when you underestimate someone who has spent their entire career turning challenges into victories, you're not just wrong about that person, you're wrong about the nature of leadership itself. This exchange will be remembered as a defining moment, not just for Crockett's career, but for American political discourse. It showed us what happens when we move beyond narrow definitions of worthiness and embrace the full spectrum of human experience that makes our democracy stronger. But the real power of this moment isn't just in what Crockett accomplished, it's in what her example makes possible for all of us. Every person who has ever been told their background isn't the right background. Every dreamer who has been dismissed because their path didn't follow traditional routes. Every leader who brings different kinds of expertise to the table, they all have a stake in celebrating this victory. The truth prevailed over assumptions that day, and it will continue to prevail every time we choose to support leaders based on substance over pedigree, results over resumes, and vision over conventional credentials. If this moment inspired you, if you recognize the importance of supporting diverse leadership, if you believe that excellence can emerge from unexpected places, then share this story. Tell us about the underestimated leaders in your own community who deserve recognition. Help us build a movement that celebrates all forms of authentic preparation for public service. Subscribe for more moments like this, where courage meets opportunity and truth transforms the conversation. Because this is just the beginning of what's possible when we demand better from our politics and better for our democracy. The critics have been silenced. Now let's amplify the voices that matter. Most